Good afternoon, and I'll just be talking about fire legacy and its role in current and future fire management in the southwestern United States. And I just want to say that when I talk about fire legacy, what I mean is the overall impact of fire on ecosystems. And I'm going to be focusing on Forest Service lands in the Southwest, so Arizona and New Mexico. And I'm going to be very ecosystem-centric in this discussion. So I'm not going to talk about how complex fire management really is when we talk about values at risk, protecting private property, and those kinds of things. We're just going to be looking at ecosystems, really. So keep that in mind as I go through this, and don't think I'm ignoring completely how complex a fire management is, but more that we're just going to focus on the ecosystem side for today. So I'm going to start off with a couple graphs that I stole from Andy Thode's presentation on patch size. And I've taken them completely out of context, and I'm using them completely out of the intent that Andy had. So this is my own interpretation, so keep that in mind as well here. So these two graphs are both looking at fire size and the number of fires on our landscapes. The top one there is looking at overall acres or hectares burned from the mid-1980s until 2011. And you can see 2011 basically stands out as a sore thumb with 1.25 million acres burned that year. So we talk about fire size and we talk about the number of fires, which is that graph on the bottom there. Those are number of fires over 1,000 acres by year. And we tend to show that to the public. That's what makes the news, is the size of a fire. And so I look at these graphs and I wonder what that means, especially when we talk about from the mid-1980s until 2011. What does that really mean for our landscapes? That we're having more fire and more bigger fire, especially when we start talking about this type of data. So this is a composite fire scar analysis, and we have these for a lot of different areas in the Southwest and across the western United States in general. And I'm just going to kind of go over what this chart says and then a little bit about the implications of it. This particular site is on the Tonto National Forest against the Mogollon Rim, Weber Creek. It covers about 2,000 acres, and this is something that I stole from Mark Kaib. So I keep stealing things from folks, but they're pretty useful as an introduction here. But I want to point out, so each of these horizontal lines along this chart depicts a tree with a fire scar. Then each of these little vertical ticks is an actual fire recorded by that tree. This chart also includes an elevation gradient. So the trees down at the bottom of this graph are at the lower elevations, while the trees at the top of this graph are at higher elevations, so spread out through the site. What we can see here from this first tree is that it started recording fires about 1780, and through 100 years of recording fires, so until 1880, it recorded at least 16 different fire events. So a lot of fire there. The other thing to notice, and that should stand out pretty drastically from this graph, is that we don't see any more fire scars between 1890 and the year 2000, or basically none. We've got a couple here and there that show up, but basically no more fire scars starting in 1890. We know that in 1890, that was when settlement kind of occurred in this area. So grazing, harvesting, general use of the land increased, and we see that fire exclusion definitely took place in these areas. But when we think back on the graphs that I just showed from Andy Thode's presentation that started looking at fire size and the number of fires in the 1980s, we're talking about from right here, and I don't know if you can see that, till right here, and I'll highlight that here in color. So we're talking about this time frame. right here. And if we look at that on this graph, we just don't have any fire scars in there. So I'm not sure by looking at those graphs where we have increasing fire acres in the past even century, if that tells us a whole lot about the needs of our landscapes, especially when we're considering this kind of data. So the question is, what do our landscapes need? How much fire do our landscapes need, especially relative to reference conditions? According to this site, now again this was about 2,000 acres, we see that overall, so all fires recorded, this landscape saw fire every year in historical context. So between about 1725 and the late 1800s, so 1890, this landscape saw some kind of fire event every year. We can also start to look at the actual extent of fire, so the spatial extent. When we see these areas that have fire scars recorded by several trees on the same year, we can assume that that's one fire event that spread spatially across that site for all of those trees. So that allows us to kind of determine the spatial extent of these fires. So Mark Hyde came up with basically some information on how often and then how big these fires were. And what we see is that we saw fires every 2 to 3 years up to 250 acres on this site. Every 3 to 6 years, we would see fires from 250 acres to 1,200 acres. And every 3 to 10 years, we would see a fire event that was greater than 1,200 acres. So still a lot of fire for this little landscape. And this is just 2,000 acres on the Tonto National Forest. So what does this mean for the entire region? So both Arizona and New Mexico, where we know we have these systems that were historically adapted to frequent fire. So what we can do is we can do a little bit of what I call some Hillbilly Nap. And what we can think about is how much acres of certain vegetation types do we have. So in this example, we have 6.7 million acres of ponderosa pine and dry mixed conifer forests on Forest Service lands in Arizona and New Mexico. So I'm only talking about two vegetation types, so ponderosa pine and dry mixed conifer forests, both of which have high frequency fire histories. But I'm not talking about any of the PJ savannas or grasslands that also have high frequency fire regimes. And I'm only talking about Forest Service lands, so no state lands, BLM lands, those kinds of things. These vegetation types, based on some of the data that I just showed across the region, historically average approximately 10-year fire return intervals, with a range of 2 to 24 years based on literature. So if we take that 10-year fire return interval, we would expect to see 670,000 acres a year burn in these two vegetation types. If we gave ourselves a break and we said that every 20 years these vegetation types should burn, we would need to burn 335 acres a year. So how much fire are we seeing on these landscapes? Over the past 12 years, so if you'll remember from Andy's graph, the past 12 years are the years of the most fire acres from 1980s till now, and with the most fire events. So over these past 12 years, wildfires have burned on average 154,000 acres a year. Now I want to mention here that these 12 years obviously encompass the Wallow Fire, the Whitewater Baldy Fire, these big fire events, but when we average them out over the past 12 years, we still see 154,000 acres a year instead of a couple million or something. So on average, we then prescribe fire, and this includes pile burning, about 50,000 acres a year in the Forest Service on these two vegetation types. So this does not include any prescribed fire that we put in grasslands or in PJ woodlands, that kind of thing. So that equals a total of a little over 200,000 acres a year of fire on these landscapes. So obviously, just looking at this very simple math, which is coarse, that's a nice way to put it, we're deficit quite a bit based on historical fire regime. So then the question is this enough? How are our landscapes burning? And is this really something that we can say is resilient over time for our landscapes? And that brings us to the questions for today's webinar. Now obviously that brings up a ton of questions, but I'm just going to focus on these 3 or 4 little questions that we can address with some of the data that I've got. So first of all, do fire scars affect how we manage current and future fires? So can we really see a difference with areas that have fire scars on the landscape and fires burning in and around them? Can we see a difference in how we manage those fires? And then can we see a difference in how those fires burn through those fire scars? So what is the effect of those fires, especially when we're talking about a fire that burned into a past fire scar? And then how have fires burned in different vegetation types? And this gets back to fire regimes. So if we're talking about a ponderosa pine forest, is it burning with low severity or is it burning with high severity? And how does that compare to its historical fire regime, or what we'd expect to see based on its fire regime? And then the last big question is, can these kind of results or these kind of data make any changes or give us any kind of indications of how we should manage the next fire? So let's start off by talking about fire scars. So do they affect how we manage fires, and can we show that? I'm going to make a point here that we obviously know that they affect how we manage fires. Anybody who's stepped out on the line and fought a fire knows that if you have a fire scar in the area, you most likely will be using it to anchor off of or put some line against, etc. So it's something that we definitely look for on the landscape and manage for. But can we show that? Can we show that to Washington, for instance? And can we show that to our publics? And what does that mean for our landscapes? So trying to get at that question, we came up, and I have to acknowledge that Linda Wadley worked a lot with me on this. So when I say we, it generally means Linda Wadley and myself. So what we did is we decided that logically, the greater percent perimeter and percent area of a fire interacting with past fires might equal less cost per acre, less duration of the fire event, and less overall acres. We did not look for or account for, we basically ignored weather, values at risk, topography, management types, any kind of suppression action and what that would do to the fire, land use histories. Basically ignored everything except for the cost per acre, the duration of the fire, the final fire acres, and then how much of that fire was interacting with past fire scars on that landscape. So what we looked at is 31 fires from the past 3 years. 16 of those fires were from 2011. Again, that was a big year, so 1.25 million acres. 9 fires from 2012 with 425,000 acres, and 6 fires from 2013 covering about 205,000 acres. And I just want to go back to something I said earlier, where when we had looked at how many acres should burn in only ponderosa pine and mixed conifer and dry mixed conifer, we were talking about 670,000 acres for a 10-year fire return interval and 335 or so thousand acres a year in a 20-year fire return interval. So when we're talking about these 425,000 acres and 205,000 acres in all vegetation types, we kind of put them in context a little bit based on maybe what that landscape means historically. So just something to think about. Then we looked at suppression costs. So only suppression costs. We did not look at rehab costs or any cost to communities, any values, etc. We looked at duration in days, and then final fire size for all these fires. And then, of course, we looked at fire history. We focused on the past 10 years, and that is based on a lot of experience showing that fire scars that are older than 10 years don't tend to have as much influence on the next fire. But I'll get back to that at the end of this presentation because obviously there's certain circumstances where that's not quite the case. So I'm really showing this type of graph, which is confusing and I realize it doesn't say anything. So let me try to explain it a little bit. We have percent over on the y-axis, And on the x-axis, we have duration in days. The red squares are the percent perimeter, and the black triangles are the percent area. So if we were to look at, let me get my pointer here, this red square here, this would mean that this fire experienced, let's see, he was right about at 75% of its perimeter was interacting with a fire scar of some kind, and it lasted about 18 days. If we look at the black triangle here, we can say this fire, about 92% of its fire area was interacting with past fire scars, and it also lasted about 18 days. So what we're trying to show here is that any kind of relationship in duration, so perhaps the more fire scars you have on the landscape, the less long the fire is going to burn, which is not being shown here at all. This graph is kind of a clump of a mess, so we're not seeing any kind of trends. The only thing we can see is that most of our fires seem to be below this 10 line, this 10% line. So a lot of fires that we see on our landscapes have less than 10% of their perimeters and 10% of their area interacting with past fire scars. So that's an interesting little thing to think about. So let's see if fire size, the final fire size, can give us any more information. So again, we have percent on the y-axis, and then we have fire size in thousands of acres on the x-axis. One thing that jumps out is that most fires are clustered here on the bottom left-hand side of the graph, which would mean that they are less than 100,000 acres in size, and they had less than 10% of their perimeter and area interacting with past fire scars. But if we look more, if we kind of expand our view of this graph a little bit, we can also see that the fires with the most interactions with past fire scars, so these guys over here, so they have 75% or more of their area and perimeter interacting with past fire scars, are also some of the smallest fires. We can also look at some of the bigger fires. So these are some of the bigger fires in this area, also have some of the least amount of interaction with past fire scars. So getting a little bit more interesting, but still not saying a whole lot here. What about costs? So costs, I split these graphs into two, and you'll see the axes are a little different here. So we have cost per acre here on the y-axis, and then we have percents on the bottom of these graphs. And I want to say a couple things about costs. We know, looking at these 31 fires, and I probably should have put these graphs up, but I apologize for that. We know that as a fire increases in size, its total cost increases. There's a definite relationship there. However, what we want to know is if the cost of management, so basically perhaps the complexity of managing that fire, increases as well. When we look at fire size and cost per acre, we don't see that relationship. So we can say that cost per acre is an even metric for fires, no matter what size they end up being. So just kind of an explanation. I hope that isn't too confusing. Anyways, so here we have perimeter, percent perimeter on the left-hand side with the red, and percent area with the triangles on the right-hand side. What's interesting here, especially when we look over to the area graph, so the graph on the right, we definitely see kind of this L shape. So we see dots following the y-axis and following the x-axis. We still have this cluster of fires here that end up being with low percentage of interaction with past fires. But then as we go up the y-axis, we see a couple more fires here. And that means that they're increasing in cost per acre. So as they increase in cost per acre, they're kind of sticking to that left-hand side of the graph, indicating that they're not having more interactions with fires, with past fires. When we look at the bottom, so the x-axis, we can see that as fires increase in interactions with past fires, so like for example this point here, and then this point here, they're not crossing this threshold of $200 per acre. So we see basically that as fires have more interactions with fire scars, they tend to cost, or seem to by this graph, cost a little bit less. And the fires that cost the most per acre tend to be the ones with the less amount of interactions with past fires. So I haven't run stats on this. I can't give you if this is significant or not, but I can give you another Hillbilly Nap in the manager's translation here. And what we come up with when we run some numbers is that fires with less than 25% of their perimeter interacting with past fires cost on average $370 an acre. Fires with more than 25% of their perimeter interacting with past fires cost about $140 per acre. And the same can be said with area, but that cutoff becomes more at the 10%, which is kind of interesting because when I ran these numbers with just 2011 and 2012 data, that cutoff was right about 30%, but adding the 2013 data brought it to 10%. So anyway, so fires with less than 10% of the area in past fires scars cost on average about $350 an acre, and fires with more than 10% of the area in past fire scars cost on average about $200 per acre. So a little bit of a difference there, and kind of interesting. Okay, so we can see that there's some kind of management going on with past fire scars. What about severity? So what about effects within these fire scars? We're going to use severity as a proxy for effects on the landscape. So how are these areas burning that have burned previously? Again, our logic here is that areas that have burned in the past 10 years would not support as much high severity fire as areas that have not experienced fire in the past 10 years. But again, we did not account for weather, topography, values of risk, management actions, etc., and we also did not account for the severity at which the past fire burned at. So for example, on the Grand Canyon, they're seeing some interesting interactions with areas that have burned with high severity, burning again with high severity the next time they burn. So we did not look at the severity of the previous burn. We just looked to see if they had. So presence-absence kind of analysis. So same 31 fires, we used ravage severity mapping. We did not do any kind of accuracy assessment, so that causes some problems, but overall gives us a little bit of an idea of what's going on. We used the fire history for the past 10 years, and then we determined severity in areas that had burned in the past 10 years and areas that hadn't. What we see is this kind of trend. So the big graph here is the overall results for all 3 years. We have the percent area on the y-axis, and then we have the severity categories on the x-axis, where 0% would mean 0% basal area loss, or very low severity. And then at the other end of this graph would be greater than 75% basal area loss. So a lot of change relative to pre-fire conditions. The red bars are going to be those areas that had not experienced fire in the previous 10 years, so outside of fire scars. And the green bars would be those areas that had experienced fire in the past 10 years, so inside fire scars. What we can see is that areas outside of past fire scars, 20% of those acres were burning with low severity, while inside past fire scars, about 34% of those areas are burning with low severity. The flip side of that would be that about 41% of the areas that had not experienced fire are burning with high severity, while 21% of the areas inside past fire scars are burning with high severity. And we can see the same trend if we break out each year. So 2011, 2012, and 2013 kind of show similar trends there, where we see areas that had experienced past fire burning with less severity than those that had not. So a little bit interesting there. Again, this kind of shows us that fire scars are obviously having an effect on these landscapes. Okay, so one thing I want to make mention here is when we talk about severity, it's always relative to pre-fire conditions. So the greatest change from pre-fire conditions is going to have the greatest severity. And what I would really like to focus on, hopefully in the next couple of years and get some more data on, is in areas that we have, and we know we have these areas, 75% or more too much basal area relative to reference conditions. So we have way too many trees per acre relative to reference conditions, and they burn with high severity where 75% of that basal area is removed. What are we left with? Are we left with something close to reference conditions, or are we left with a bunch of junk? So basically what I would like to do is kind of focus on, instead of focusing on what the fire removes, but what the fire leaves, and what does that mean in a historical context. So just food for thought there. This is another slide I stole from Andy Thode and kind of continues with the point of severity with fire scars. Again, I've taken this completely out of context, but you can see that Arizona and New Mexico are depicted here, and the areas in black are fire scars from the mid-1980s, and the areas in red are patches of high severity within those fire scars. And what I want to point out here, or something that kind of stands out to me, is this area right in here. And I can't draw with this thing, but nonetheless, right in here. So this is the Gila region. And there's a lot of black in here, so a lot of fire scars, but very little red. So very little high severity patches relative to the other areas near it. So the Gila kind of stands out in this, and that kind of makes sense when we think back on its management history and its proactive use of fire and fire management still today. So interesting to think about there. Okay, so now let's move on to fire severity in different vegetation types. So how are different vegetation types burning, and what does that mean relative to their fire regime? So here we looked at 20 of the largest fires in 2011, 12, and 13, and those are the names of the fires there if you're interested. And we looked again at ravage data and biophysical settings to see the vegetation type, and then the fire regime based on land fire and VDDT modeling. And what we find, and I'm going to go straight to results here and we'll talk a little bit more about this, is for high frequency, low severity fire regimes, we see this kind of pattern. So these pie charts here depict the percentage of acres in that vegetation type that burned with different severities. The numbers underneath each vegetation type, so 10 fires for lower montane pine oak vegetation type, is 10 fires out of the 20 fires we looked at burned predominantly in this vegetation type. And in those 10 fires, 47% of those acres burned with high severity. 20% of those acres burned with moderate to high severity, 22% burned with moderate, and then 11% of those acres burned with low severity. So when we talk about high frequency, low severity fire regimes, we would expect to see predominantly the vegetation type burning with low severity and just some slivers of higher severity mixed in here and there. I'm going to skip dry mixed conifer. Obviously it looks different. Let's go down the conifers or pine woodlands here. So 9 fires out of the 20 that we looked at burned predominantly in this vegetation type. And we see kind of an even mix across those severities. So probably a lot less low severity than we would expect historically. And then when we jump over to dry mixed conifer, things get kind of interesting here. And there's a couple of things to cover. One, dry mixed conifer is a little bit difficult to map out and tease out from regular mixed conifer, from all mixed conifer, so wet mixed conifer, dry mixed conifer. So the spatial data isn't as nice and clear as we'd like it to be, but this is what we've gotten so far. And the other thing is we only had 2 fires out of those 20 fires we looked at that burned predominantly in this vegetation type based on our spatial data that we had. And most of those acres out of those 2 fires were from the silver fire. And the silver fire was once again on the Gila. So the Gila stands out once again. Here we see that 74% of those acres burned with low severity, and while the rest, 26 or so percent rest, burned with a little bit higher severity. So much more what we'd expect based on its historical fire regime for that vegetation type. Looking at the other side of the spectrum, so we're looking more at low frequency with mixed severity fire. So in these cases, we'd probably expect kind of an even distribution of fire severities across this landscape with some high severity, some low, etc. What becomes important for these vegetation types is patch size, and I have not looked at patch size at all in here, but Andy has done a lot of work on that, and so she might be a better source for that information. But based on our data, this is what we found. So it's more the wet mixed conifer. We had 9 fires out of the 20 fires burned predominantly in this vegetation type, with 47% of those acres burning with high severity. We talk about pinus and juniper woodlands, and this is not savannas, so this is more of that mixed severity fire regime. We had 14 fires out of the 20 burned in this vegetation type, and 45 or so percent of those acres burned with high severity. And then the aspen mixed conifer type, 5 of the 20 fires burned predominantly in that vegetation type, with 42% being in the high severity category. So perhaps historically we'd want to see more of a 25, 25, 25 kind of mix, whereas all of these vegetation types are showing pretty close to 50% of their acres burning with high severity, but overall much closer to their historic fire regime than what we saw in the previous vegetation types. Okay, so let's look at a few examples. The Miller Fire. So this really horrible map that I made here, this red line is the final perimeter of the Miller Fire. The areas in green are fires post-2003, so newer fires, and the areas in yellow are fires that are older than 2003, so fire scars. So you can see a lot of fire in here within the perimeter of the Miller Fire. So the Miller Fire was 2011, early 2011, and I'll say that it was very, very windy conditions when this fire burned, although I didn't look at that, but I just know that from experience. Burned about 90,000 acres. Total costs were $13.3 million, coming out to be about $151 per acre, and it burned for about 47 days. 64% of its area was within past fire scars, and 52% of its perimeter was interacting with past fire scars. We see 48% high to moderate fire severity outside fire scars, and 32% high to moderate fire severity inside fire scars. This is an example, the Dry Lakes Fire, so this area in here, burned with quite a bit of high severity, and when the Miller Fire burned over it, it burned again with high severity. So again, that relationship between past fire severity and new fire severity is kind of interesting, but we did not look at it here. So as compared to the Wallow Fire, this was also in 2011, a little bit later in the year. Of course, we probably know about this fire. Over 500,000 acres, $83.2 million spent in suppression for this fire. It ended up being about $155 per acre, so pretty similar to the Miller Fire, interestingly enough. And it burned for about 40 days, which is also pretty similar to the Miller Fire's 47 days. However, only 10% of its area was within past fire scars, and only 6% of its perimeter was interacting with past fire scars. And what we see here is almost 60% of those areas outside fire scars burned with high to moderate fire severity, and 50% of the areas inside fire scars also burned with high to moderate fire severity. So much more high severity on this fire. In contrast, we can look at the Whitewater Baldy Fire, and also very big fire, about 300,000 acres, burned in 2012 on the Gila. About $20 million spent on suppression, but now we're seeing about $67 per acre, and it burned for 64 days. So a longer duration event and much cheaper per acre. What we also see here is a huge amount of fire scars, and I realize this map is gosh awful, but we see again these areas in yellow and in green are past fire scars, and the red is the actual perimeter of the Wallow Fire. We can also see that down here is the Miller Fire, and the Miller Fire effectively stopped the Whitewater Baldy Fire as it was coming into this area here. So 40% of the area that the Whitewater Baldy Fire burned over had experienced fire in the past 10 years. 31% of its perimeter was interacting with past fire scars. And what we see here is 17% of the areas within past fire scars experience high to moderate severity, so much less than the past two fires we've looked at. And 52% of the areas outside fire scars burn with high to moderate fire severity. Much of that being in these areas here, which are higher elevation mixed conifer forest types, which probably could have had higher severity historically, but also are mixed with dry mixed conifer, and again, that's hard to tease out, and we know that the two are starting to act a lot alike, and we're losing that dry mixed conifer component. So, interesting fire there. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about the Sunflower Fire because it's just an anomaly. A much smaller fire, so 1,700 acres or so, costing about $5.5 million. And now we're looking at $337 per acre, so much more expensive than the past three fires we have looked at. But a lot of values at risk on this fire and a totally different vegetation type, which I'll talk about here in a second. Burned for about 51 days. Only had about 3% of its area interacting with past fires in the past 10 years, and 37% of its perimeter. Now, the area in red here, again, is the Sunflower Fire perimeter here. And to the north of it, in that teal color, is the Wallow Fire that burned in 2002. And then to the west of this fire, in the green, is the Basin Fire that burned in 1994. So outside of that 10-year limit that I had looked at past fire scars, but very important in this case. Both of these fire scars, so the Wallow Fire and the Basin Fire, were used extensively for suppression action. So we know from experience on the ground that these two fire scars were a huge impact on how big the Sunflower Fire got and how long it lasted on the landscape. The fuel type in here is mostly chaparralic fuels. So we're talking about a system that saw low frequency fire, high severity fire. So first of all, one thing to note is that the Basin Fire lasted much longer on that landscape, and it's still influencing that landscape. So from 1994 to present, it is still available to mitigate fuels. So again, that long duration fire regime is different than those frequent fire regimes in this case. And that very volatile fuel type definitely increases the complexity of fire management, as can be seen by the costs of this fire. Okay, so given all that, let's go back to our questions here. So do fire scars affect how we manage current and future fires? Duration and final fire size really didn't tell us a whole lot, except for maybe telling us that most of our fires don't have much interaction with past fires. But costs per acre seem to be reduced as fire scars increase. So something maybe to play with a little bit more as we go into the future with this. And then how did fires burn in past fire scars? We overall see less high severity and more low severity in past fire scars. And then vegetation types, for overall we see the high frequency fire regimes are burning with more high severity than would be expected historically. And then the big question, so can these results indicate any lessons for the next fire? So future fire management, what does this mean? And I have 3 dots there because it's endless. But what I want to really hammer is that we did not look at location, weather, management strategies, values at risk, etc. These are very important factors in how we manage fires. But what we can say is that from a spatial scale, we see somewhat of a break point at 25% of the perimeter and 10% of the fire area, where costs seem to be reduced. So obviously this might indicate, especially when we think about most of our fires being on the lower end of those graphs, so not interacting with a lot of fire, we need more fire on our landscape to really see an impact from fire legacy. Temporally speaking, we know that frequent fire regimes, we have about a 10-year lifespan on the scar's influence, which would indicate that we need fire more often in these vegetation types. And that we also need to talk about more the sunflower fire kind of instances where we have these vegetation types that hold fire scars much longer. So the southwestern area obviously has a variety of fire regimes. Some are historically fuel limited, so they would burn quite often, and that lack of fuel would decrease the size of the next fire. And others are climate limited, where so higher elevations where we have low crown-based heights in general, we have a lot of fuel on the ground, but the climate doesn't really allow fire to spread in those areas. The consequences in light of climate change, especially for those higher elevation climates, are pretty interesting. So that would probably indicate that under the current models that we're seeing, those areas are going to become more and more available to burn, those higher elevation climates. And that, to me, would indicate that where we do have a little bit more control, perhaps, is we need to reestablish fuel-limited systems so we can offset some of these other areas that might begin to burn, which would, again, mean that we need more fire more often on many of these landscapes. And I'll end with a quote from a firefighter that I have a ton of respect for, and I'll let you read it, but I'll just say that another way to look at this is every time we catch a fire, it's the opportunity for the next fire, which effectively increases and delays our future risk. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Well, that was excellent, Tessa. Very interesting, and I'm still sort of processing some of those slides you put up there. We'll go ahead and open it for questions now. So if you have a question, you can type it in the chat window, or I will also unmute the phone line so you can ask your questions over the phone line. And while I'm doing that, maybe, Tessa, you could follow up and let folks know, is this data, the story you're telling, is this something you're going to publish in a journal, or is it available, you're going to put it in a GTR or something like that?
You know, I haven't even really thought about publishing, to be honest, but I can make it available to anybody who's interested, and I do tend to present this a little bit here and there, and it would be great to have it published. To be honest, I don't have the time to look at that right now. Yeah.
I know how that goes. So are there other questions out there? Pepe, I know you must have a question.
I have a kind of a technical question. And I mean, kind of like Xander is working on this document, kind of a summary of the 2013 fire season, and in it he has kind of the bear maps and the ravage maps kind of side by side, and so I'm kind of, one of the things that you did is I really don't, I haven't played around with the ravage maps as much, so I kind of don't know how to interpret them. And then you kind of complicated that for me because you combined high and moderate. Why combine high and moderate, and what does that look like in the ground?
Yeah, so in the examples there, I combined high and moderate. Pepe, you're right. So that would be taking the 25% to 75% basal area loss and putting it together. So yeah, basically on the ground it's saying that anytime you have a significant amount of your canopy being affected by the fire, I'm considering that to be high or moderate. Now in the graphs before that, I did not lump those, so they were separated when I talked about low, moderate, moderate, high, and high. Those were still the original categories, so 0%, etc.
So but I mean, my question is, could you have an even 75% canopy loss that might actually do some good I mean, because, you know, we have such high basal areas that we could probably stand to lose 75% and still be good. I mean, they're not all moonscapes, right?
Right. I agree with you 100%, Pepe, and that was my whole little soapbox that I got on there during the slide with severity, is that severity is relative to pre-fire conditions, any of the severity, bark severity included. So when we look at that, if our pre-fire conditions are way overstocked and we're losing 75% of that stock, I want to know what's left and what does that mean relative to what that ecosystem needs. In a lot of places, from just looking around, so this is very anecdotal, I think it's done a lot of good. So that's a really good question, and I'd really like to get some data to support that, or not, or whatever the situation may be.
Yeah, I'm just, because like I was telling Xander, that I think there should be a 99% canopy loss or 100% canopy loss. That way because I mean, to me, isn't that where, that's what I kind of don't like to see, is that 100% mortality. Because even if you leave a couple of trees, that's a big difference than leaving no trees at all.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Other questions out there?
So another one of my questions was about the time since the last fire. So you cut it off at 10 years, but I mean, to my knowledge, there hasn't. I mean, there's been done work in California that kind of suggests that, but there hasn't been much in the Southwest. So are we just kind of using the California data, or did you kind of test that a little bit?
Yeah, so that was based on some of the California stuff, and then also based on experience.
Okay.
And like I said, that doesn't hold true in most places. It was a convenient cutoff with the load of data we had. How's that?
Because, for example, I mean, I don't know if you were on the Silver Fire, because the Silver Fire, you know, people kept saying this was the first time it burned, but really it was the second time it had burned in the 50s.
Exactly.
So it was really the second time it had burned since 1900. So I think that's kind of like, I still think there's a little bit, I have a little bit of a hard time kind of just taking the California data and putting it to the Southwest. I mean, and I think it's easy enough to probably go ahead and do. The Forest Service has pretty good data, at least in terms of fire perimeters going back to the 70s, right?
Yeah, it gets iffy, and that was part of our constraint. But yeah, you're absolutely right, Pepe. There's a lot of places, and that's why I brought up the Sunflower Fire, is where we see those fires lasting a lot longer.
Yeah, I mean, you can hypothesize that and say, you know, okay, take the fires that have burned in areas that were, you know, 20-year fires, 20-year-old fires and 10-year-old fires, and then according to the hypothesis, you would expect the severity to be much higher in the older fires, you know. So I think it's something that I think could be really doable.
Absolutely.
I mean, I'm kind of short for time myself, but I think that, I mean, this is exactly what the Joint Fire Science is calling for on their call for proposals this year.
Yeah, excellent. Well, let's talk more.
All right.
Other folks have questions? We're just about at an hour. Well, maybe with that then, unless someone wants to jump in, I'll go ahead and thank Tessa again. It was a really excellent presentation and the kind of data that makes you think. So I hope that you know, folks who are on the webinar today can share this information with their colleagues. I'll send up a follow-up email with a link to the recording. And as you're leaving, we will send you off to a survey to let us know how the webinar went, and it's a good opportunity for you to suggest other webinar topics. So if you like this one and you want to see more information about costs or fire scars, that's a chance to give us feedback on that.
Hey, Xander, do you have the exact dates for the next two webinars?
No, sorry, I don't. We'll get those soon, though. They should be the third Wednesday, but December we might move up because of it gets towards annual leave.
Okay.
So thanks, everybody.
All right.
Thank you.
All right. See you guys.
Thanks, Xander.